The silence in the penthouse was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of a held breath, the silence of a predator waiting for the grass to rustle. Junho stood by the floor-to-ceiling glass, his reflection superimposed over the sprawling, glittering nervous system of the city below. He was 31, a king in a kingdom built on leverage, debt, and the violent enforcement of contracts. His empire was constructed of steel and fear. He knew the price of everything, the cost of a shipping container of illicit electronics, the bribe required for a port authority officer, the settlement for a broken leg, but he understood the value of absolutely nothing. He was handsome in the way a marble statue is handsome, flawless, cold, and entirely incapable of bleeding. Tonight, however, the marble was cracking. It wasn't a rival syndicate encroaching on his territory or a police investigation that disturbed his icy equilibrium. It was a receipt, a discrepancy, a missing inventory of premium foodstuffs and medical supplies that had vanished from his personal pantry over the last month. Junho turned from the window, his eyes scanning the minimalist expanse of his living room. The furniture was Italian leather, sharp-edged and uncomfortable. The art was abstract, chosen for its appreciation potential rather than its beauty. And moving through this sterile landscape was Elena. She was 27, an African-American woman whose beauty was a quiet rebellion against the harshness of her uniform. The dark blue fabric concealed her figure, but it could not hide the grace of her movements or the profound, sorrowful intelligence in her eyes. She dusted the mantelpiece with a rhythm that was almost hypnotic.
Swipe. Pause. Swipe. Pause.
Junho watched her, his suspicion coiling in his gut like a viper. He had trusted her. In his line of work, trust was a currency more valuable than gold, and spending it on the wrong person was a fatal error. He had allowed her into a sanctuary, ignored the background checks that were standard protocol for his soldiers, and now, he believed, she was bleeding him dry. Not in millions, but in ounces. It was not the theft that enraged him. It was the audacity. It was the smile she offered him when she handed him his morning espresso, a smile he now classified as a lie, a deception, a mask. Elena finished her shift at 8 p.m. sharp. She did not linger. She changed out of her indoor slippers, picked up 2 heavy, reusable grocery bags that she had brought with her, and headed for the service elevator. Junho waited until the digital numbers above the lift reached the lobby. Then, he grabbed his black trench coat, checked the pistol holstered beneath his arm, a force of habit, reassuring weight against his ribs, and followed. He told himself this was about discipline. He told himself that he needed to see where the stolen goods were going. Was she selling his imported truffles to a fence? Was she feeding a lover who laughed at Junho's stupidity? The narrative he constructed in his mind was ugly, fueled by a lifetime of betrayal. He expected to find a rat. He was prepared to crush it. He stepped into the elevator, the mirrored walls reflecting a man who had everything, yet felt an inexplicable, gnawing hunger for a truth he couldn't name. He descended into the night, leaving the cold blue light of his tower for the chaotic shadows of the street, unaware that the descent would break him apart. The city air at ground level was thick with humidity and the smell of exhaust, a stark contrast to the filtered, climate-controlled oxygen of the penthouse. Junho spotted Elena immediately. She was a silhouette against the garish neon of a convenience store sign, her shoulders hunched under the weight of the 2 bags. She did not hail a taxi. She did not walk toward the subway station that would take her to the residential districts. Instead, she turned north, heading toward the older, crumbling sector of the city where the streetlights flickered and the zoning laws were mere suggestions. Junho followed, keeping a tactical distance. His Italian leather shoes clicked softly on the pavement, a rhythmic counterpoint to the distant sirens wailing like banshees.
Click, click, click.
He was a shark in a stream, out of his depth but still dangerous. He watched her stop at a crosswalk. She shifted the bags, grimacing. The plastic handles must have been cutting into her fingers, slicing into the soft flesh, yet she did not set them down.
Why?
What was in those bags that was so urgent? He analyzed the shape of the bags as she walked under a functioning streetlight. They were bulging uneven. Not electronics. Not cash. Groceries. The mundane nature of the burden confused him. If she was stealing from him, why walk 3 miles with heavy produce? The logic didn't fit the crime he had invented. He watched her navigate through a crowd of late-night revelers. Men catcalled her, their voices slurred and predatory. Junho's hand twitched toward his holster, a sudden, irrational surge of protectiveness flaring in his chest before he ruthlessly tamped it down. She was the enemy, he reminded himself. She was the thief. The architecture around them began to change. The glass skyscrapers receded, replaced by brick tenements with barred windows and fire escapes that rusted like exposed veins. The streets here were darker, the shadows longer. This was the part of the city Junho owned on paper. He collected protection money from the businesses here, but he had never walked these sidewalks. He was a ghost landlord, harvesting crops he never planted. Elena turned down an alleyway that smelled of rain and rot. It was a dead end, blocked by a condemned warehouse with boarded-up windows. Junho pressed himself against the rough brick of the corner building, his heart hammering against his ribs. This was it. The drop-off. He expected a drug deal. He expected a gang meeting. He peered around the edge, his eyes adjusting to the gloom. Elena stopped at a rusted metal side door. She didn't knock. She pulled a key from her pocket, a key that looked ancient and fragile, and unlocked the door. She disappeared inside, the heavy steel clanging shut behind her, leaving Junho alone with the dripping water pipes and his own darkening assumptions. He waited a full minute, counting the seconds.
1, 2,
3. Then he moved. He approached the door, finding it unlocked. He pushed it open just an inch, enough to slip through, stepping from the cold indifference of the alley into a warm, humid corridor that smelled, inexplicably, of roasted garlic, thyme, and hope. The interior of the warehouse was a cavernous space, stripped of its industrial machinery, but filled with a different kind of industry. Junho moved silently, his footsteps absorbed by the damp concrete. He hid behind a pillar, his eyes widening as he took in the scene. It was not a criminal den.
It was a sanctuary.
The vast room was illuminated by mismatched lamps and strings of Christmas lights, casting a golden, ethereal glow over rows of cots and makeshift tables. And there were people, dozens of them. They were the invisible people of the city, the elderly, the infirm, the forgotten veterans, the cast-offs who had slipped through the cracks of the social safety net. There were no children, no families, just the old and the broken, people who had reached the end of their utility to society and had been discarded like trash. In the center of this makeshift hospice stood Elena. She had set the grocery bags down on a long wooden table. Junho watched, paralyzed, as she began to unpack. She didn't pull out stolen caviar or truffles. She pulled out vegetables. Carrots, onions, potatoes. She pulled out bags of rice. She pulled out simple, generic painkillers and bandages. And then, he realized the source of the theft. The items she was unpacking were not the premium goods from his pantry. They were the things he had ordered his staff to throw away because they were nearing their expiration dates. The bruised apples. The day-old bread. The dented cans. She hadn't stolen his wealth. She had salvaged his waste. She was recycling his apathy into survival. He watched her tie a white apron over her blue uniform. The transformation was instantaneous. The reserved, silent maid who cleaned his floors vanished, replaced by a woman of commanding gentleness. She moved among the cots with a familiarity that spoke of months, perhaps years, of service. She didn't just distribute food. She distributed dignity. She knelt beside a man whose face was a roadmap of deep wrinkles and scars, a man who looked like he hadn't heard a kind word in a decade. She took a bowl of soup, steaming, rich, fragrant, and spoon-fed him. She wiped his chin with a cloth, her touch as tender as a mother with a newborn. She laughed at something he whispered, a sound that rang like a bell in the vast, sad room. It was a genuine laugh, full of warmth and light, a sound Junho realized he had never earned. He felt a sudden, crushing weight in his chest. It wasn't the pistol. It was shame. Profound, suffocating shame. He looked at the victims of her deception, an old woman with cataracts, a man missing a leg, a woman clutching a faded photograph. They were not co-conspirators. They were her family. She was not feeding a vice. She was feeding them. She was the only thing standing between these people and the abyss, and she was doing it with the scraps from his table. Junho remained in the shadows, his world tilting on its axis. He looked at Elena and saw her for the first time. Really saw her. In the penthouse, she was an employee, a line item, a beautiful object to be managed. Here, in this cathedral of the broken, she was a giant. He saw the sweat glistening on her forehead as she worked, moving from cot to cot, checking temperatures, adjusting blankets, holding hands. He saw the way the light caught the curve of her cheekbone, highlighting a beauty that had nothing to do with cosmetics or lighting and everything to do with the soul. He felt a pang of something sharp and unfamiliar, not lust, but reverence. A desire to be near that light, to be worthy of it. The realization hit him in waves, each one eroding a piece of his ego. He had built an empire on the premise that everyone had a price, that everyone was selfish, that the world was a zero-sum game of predators and prey. But Elena broke his algorithm. What she was doing had no profit margin. There was no leverage here. No debt to be collected. She was giving everything she had, her time, her energy, her meager wages, for zero return. It was an act of pure, irrational grace. And it terrified him. It terrified him because it made his power look small. It made his penthouse look like a prison. He looked down at his expensive hands, the hands that had broken fingers and signed death warrants, and they looked useless. What had he built? Monuments to himself. What was she building? A home for the homeless. He took a step forward, unintentionally kicking a loose piece of gravel. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the quiet hum of the room.
Elena froze.
She turned slowly, her eyes searching the darkness. The elderly man she was feeding looked up in alarm, sensing the tension. Junho froze, caught between the urge to flee and the need to confess. He stepped out from behind the pillar, the golden light hitting his face. Elena's eyes went wide. She dropped the ladle she was holding. It clattered into the pot, splashing soup onto the table. "Mr. Park," she whispered, her voice trembling. She stepped in front of the old man, shielding him with her body. It was a reflex. She saw him not as her employer, but as the Mafia boss, the predator. She thought he was here to hurt them. She thought he was here to collect. The fear in her eyes cut him deeper than any knife ever could. It was a judgment, swift and absolute. She expected cruelty from him because that was all he had ever shown the world. Silence stretched between them, heavy and thick. The air in the room shifted. The elderly residents, sensing the threat, went still. Dozens of eyes fixed on Junho, eyes that had seen war, poverty, and abandonment. They looked at his trench coat, his polished shoes, his hard face. They knew what men like him represented. Men like him were the reason they were in this warehouse and not in their homes. Men like him were the storm. But Junho didn't look like a storm anymore. He looked like a man waking up from a long, dark coma. He looked at the grocery bags on the table, the bruised fruit, the dented cans, and then back at Elena's defiant, terrified face. "You," Junho started, his voice cracking. He cleared his throat, trying to regain the baritone of authority, but it was gone. You walked here? With those bags? It was a stupid question. A meaningless question. But it was the only thing his brain could formulate. Elena didn't lower her guard. She stood straighter, her chin lifting. They were going to be thrown out, sir. I didn't steal anything of value. Just the waste. Please, don't punish them for my mistake. If you need to fire me, fire me. But let them finish eating. Her voice was steady, despite the fear. She was bargaining for them, not for herself. She was offering herself as the sacrifice. Before the story continues, take a moment to look at your own life. We often judge people by what we see on the surface, their job, their uniform, their silence. We assume the worst because the world has taught us to be cynical. But sometimes, the people we overlook are carrying burdens we can't imagine and performing acts of heroism we don't deserve to witness. If this story is making you rethink how you see the invisible people around you, please subscribe and share this message. Let's bring the invisible into the light. Junho looked at the pot of soup. It smelled better than the 5-star meal he had left untouched on his dining table. He looked at the old man cowering behind Elena, a man clutching a spoon like a weapon. Punish them. Junho repeated, the words tasting like ash. You think I came here to punish them? He took a step closer, and Elena flinched. He stopped immediately, raising his hands, palms open. A gesture of surrender. Elena, he said, using her name for the first time without a command attached to it. I didn't know. You didn't ask, she replied. The simple truth of it struck him. He hadn't asked. He had never asked her anything. He had never asked her if she had family, if she was happy, if she was tired. He had treated her as a function, not a person. I thought, he paused, looking around the room at the peeling paint, the leaking roof, the sheer poverty of the place. I thought you were stealing from me. I was, she said, her eyes blazing. I was stealing your trash to keep them alive. Why? He asked. Why do you do this? You have nothing. I have everything, she corrected him, gesturing to the room. I have my hands. I have my health. And I have them. They have no one, Mr. Park. The city forgot them. Your world forgot them. Someone has to remember. Her words stripped him bare. Your world forgot them. He was the architect of that world. He was the one who bought the buildings and evicted the tenants. He was the one who drove up the prices. He was the reason this warehouse was necessary. He wasn't just a bystander. He was the cause. The realization brought him to his knees figuratively and then literally. He sank down onto a rickety wooden chair, the legs groaning under his weight. He looked at Elena, really looked at her, and saw the exhaustion etched into her face. She worked all day for him, and all night for them. I have money, Junho said softly. It sounded pathetic. I have so much money. Money doesn't cook the soup, Mr. Park, Elena said, her voice softening slightly as she saw the change in his eyes. Money doesn't hold a dying hand. Money is cold. Then teach me, Junho whispered. The request hung in the air, fragile and impossible. Teach me how to be warm. Elena stared at him. She looked for the lie. She looked for the trap. But she saw only a man who was spiritually starving, sitting in a room full of people who were physically starving. She slowly lowered her arms. She turned to the table, picked up a knife and a bag of carrots. She held them out to him. Peel, she said. Junho stared at the vegetable. He had never peeled a carrot in his life. He hesitated, then stood up. He took off his trench coat, laying it over the back of the chair. He unbuttoned his cuffs and rolled up the sleeves of his $1,000 shirt. He took the knife. It was dull and cheap. He took the carrot. It was crooked and covered in dirt. He looked at Elena, waiting for instruction. She didn't smile. She just nodded. And for the first time in his life, the Mafia boss went to work. Not for profit, not for power, but for soup.
Click.
Scrape.
Click. Scrape.
The sound was different from his shoes on the pavement. It was the sound of redemption beginning, one carrot at a time, another, and another, and another. The first hour was a lesson in humility that no boardroom brawl could ever teach. The knife was blunt, the carrots were knotted with roots, and Junho's hands insured for millions, hands that signed contracts determining the fate of shipping lanes, were cramping. He sat on the rickety chair, his Italian dress shirt rolled to the elbows, a splatter of muddy water staining the silk cuff.
Swipe. Peel. Swipe. Peel.
The rhythm was foreign, clumsy. Next to him, Elena worked with the speed and precision of a machine, her knife a blur of silver. She did not praise him. She did not scold him. She simply let him be. Around them, the warehouse hummed with the quiet, desperate noise of survival. Coughs, the shuffle of feet, the clinking of spoons against plastic bowls. Junho felt eyes on him. He looked up to see the elderly man he had frightened earlier, Samuel, he would later learn, watching him with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. Samuel had one leg, the other lost to diabetes and neglect, and his face was a map of every hard winter he had survived. He didn't see a mafia boss. He saw a man struggling with a vegetable. Samuel reached out, his hand trembling, and tapped Junho's wrist. "Too deep," Samuel rasped, his voice like grinding stones. "You're wasting the meat."
Peel thin.
Thin, it was a command, a correction. And for the first time in 10 years, Junho took an order without reaching for his gun. He nodded. "Thin," he repeated. "I understand." The vibration of his phone against his thigh felt like an invasion. It buzzed once, twice, 3 times, an angry, persistent demand for attention from the world he had left outside. It was Dae-hyun, his right hand, his enforcer, the man who ensured the wheels of the syndicate turned with blood and oil. Junho ignored it. He ignored the $1 million shipment docking at midnight. He ignored the bribe scheduled for the district attorney. In this room, under the string of Christmas lights that buzzed with a low electric hum, those things felt fictive. They felt like a game played by children who didn't know the dark. What was real was the carrot. What was real was the smell of onions sautéing in the massive pot. What was real was the heat radiating from Elena's arm as she worked beside him, a silent, steady warmth that seemed to thaw the ice in his veins. He looked at her profile, the concentration in her brow, the stray curl of hair falling over her ear, and felt a terrifying clarity. He had spent his life building a fortress to keep people out. She had spent her life building a fire to bring people in. The contrast made him feel small. It made him feel invisible. He wasn't the protagonist of this story. He was the villain who had stumbled onto the wrong set. And for the first time, he wanted to change the script. By the time the soup was ready, Junho's fingers were raw and stained orange. He stood up, his back aching in a way that the ergonomic leather chair in his penthouse never permitted. The serving line formed. It was a procession of the forgotten. Beatrice, a woman with silver hair matted on one side and a photograph of a burning house clutched in her hand, stepped forward. She didn't look at the food. She looked at Junho. Her eyes were milky with cataracts, seeing a world he couldn't perceive. "Did you bring the rain?" she asked him, her voice a whimsical sing-song. Elena stepped in gently.
No, Beatrice.
He brought the carrots. He helped make the soup. Beatrice smiled, a toothless, radiant expression that cracked her face open. "The carrot man," she whispered, as if bestowing a knighthood. "Bless you, carrot man." She took her bowl and shuffled away. Junho felt a lump form in his throat, hard and painful. He had been called boss, sir, king, and monster, but Carrot Man hit him with the force of a revelation. It was a title he had earned with sweat, not fear. He ladled the soup. "Another bowl. Another thank you." Another pair of eyes that looked at him and saw a human being, not a wallet. The repetition became a prayer. Ladle.
Pour.
Serve. Ladle.
Pour. Serve.
With every bowl, the weight of his sins didn't vanish, but it became bearable, because for tonight, he was serving penance. The next morning, the penthouse felt like a mausoleum. The silence was too clean, the air too filtered. Junho woke up in his king-sized bed, the sheets thread count perfect, and felt a profound sense of dislocation.
He looked at his hands.
They were clean now, scrubbed of the dirt and carrot juice, but they felt phantom heavy. He dressed in his suit, his armor, charcoal gray, tailored to intimidate. He drove his black sedan to the office, the city sliding past his windows like a silent film. He saw the streets differently now. He didn't see territory. He saw the alleyways where Samuel might have slept. He saw the underpasses where Beatrice might have lost her mind. When he walked into the boardroom, the air conditioning hit him like a physical blow. Dae-hyun was there, pacing, a shark in a shark tank. "Where were you?" Dae-hyun demanded, slamming a file onto the mahogany table. "The shipment. The Port Authority. I had to bribe the shift manager double because you weren't there to stare him down. You went dark, Junho." "We don't go dark." Junho looked at Dae-hyun. He saw the gold watch on his wrist, the hunger in his eyes, the absolute certainty that money was the only god worth worshipping. It was like looking in a mirror from yesterday. "I was busy," Junho said, his voice flat. He walked to the window, looking down at the ant-sized cars below. "Dae-hyun, how much do we waste?" The question hung in the air, bizarre and out of context. Dae-hyun blinked. "Waste? We run a tight ship. Margins are up, no," Junho said, turning around. "How much food? How much life? How much of us is just
Rot."
Dae-hyun frowned, stepping closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Are you having a breakdown? Because if you are, I need to know." "The sharks smell blood, Junho. If you bleed, they eat." Junho looked at his friend, his partner in crime, and realized that Dae-hyun was trapped in the same prison Junho had just found a window in. "I'm not bleeding," Junho said, picking up his briefcase. "I'm waking up. Handle the port. I have somewhere to be." He walked out, leaving Dae-hyun staring at the closed door, the silence of the boardroom suddenly feeling very loud. Junho didn't go back to the warehouse empty-handed that night.
But he didn't bring cash.
He remembered Elena's words. Money is cold. He drove to a wholesale medical supply depot, a front for one of his shell companies. He filled the trunk with meaningful things. Thick wool blankets, antibiotics,
Clean socks.
saline solution, first aid kits. He stripped the shelves, not as a boss taking inventory, but as a scavenger gathering resources. When he arrived at the alley, the sun was setting, casting long, bruised shadows across the brick. He didn't hide his car this time. He parked it right in front of the rusted door. When he entered, the atmosphere was different, tenser. He heard coughing, wet, rattling, deep chest coughs that sounded like death knocking. He found Elena by a cot in the far corner. She was kneeling beside Samuel, wiping his forehead with a rag that looked gray and tattered. Samuel was shivering, his face flushed with fever. "He needs a doctor," Elena said without looking up, her voice tight with suppressed panic. She sensed Junho's presence, accepted it. "The fever spiked an hour ago. I gave him the aspirin, but it's not enough. It's an infection." Junho knelt beside her. He touched Samuel's hand. It was burning. He looked at the leg. The stump was inflamed, angry red lines tracking up the skin.
Sepsis.
In his world, a man with sepsis went to a private clinic and was cured in hours. Here it was a death sentence. "I can take him to the hospital," Junho said, reaching for his phone. Elena stopped him, her hand gripping his forearm with surprising strength. "No ID," she whispered. No insurance. They'll stabilize him and dump him back on the street in 6 hours, or call the police because he has outstanding warrants for vagrancy. He won't go. He's terrified of them. Junho stared at Samuel's wheezing form. The system was designed to crush men like Samuel, and Junho was a beneficiary of that system. He made a decision. He dialed a number. Not an ambulance. He dialed Doc Miller, a disgrace of a physician who lost his license for pill pushing and now stitched up bullet wounds for the syndicate in the back of a veterinary clinic. Doc, Junho said, his voice dropping to the register of command he used for executions. Grab your bag. Antibiotics. IVs. Strong stuff. Come to the warehouse on 4th and Elm. You have 20 minutes, he paused, listening to the protest on the other end. If you're not here in 20, you won't have hands to practice medicine with, he hung up. He looked at Elena. She was staring at him, her eyes wide, conflicting emotions warring in her gaze, gratitude and fear. She saw the monster again, but this time, the monster was growling for her. He's coming, Junho said, smoothing the blanket over Samuel.
He's not a good man.
But he's a good doctor. Elena nodded slowly. Thank you, she whispered. Not for the money. For the power. You're using it for us. Dae-hyun did not stay in the boardroom. Suspicion was an itch he couldn't scratch, so he followed. He sat in his car at the end of the alley, watching the boss carry boxes of wool blankets into a condemned building. He watched the disgraced doctor scurry inside like a frightened rat. Dae-hyun lit a cigarette, the cherry glowing red in the dark. He didn't understand. Was Junho running a new racket?
Organ harvesting.
A stash house? It didn't make sense. Junho was a man of logic, and this was chaos. Dae-hyun pulled out his phone and made a call to the crew. Get the boys ready, he said, smoke curling from his lips. The boss is compromised. We might need to stage an intervention. Or a coup. He flicked the cigarette out the window, watching it spark on the asphalt. The old ways were threatened, and Dae-hyun was the guardian of the old ways. Inside, the warehouse transformed into a field hospital. Doc Miller worked nervously, his hands shaking until the needle was in the vein, then steadying with muscle memory. The drip began. The antibiotics flowed. Samuel's breathing eased, the rattle subsiding into a rhythmic wheeze. Junho didn't leave. He spent the night sitting on a crate, watching the 4-bag drip.
Drop, drop, drop.
Elena sat beside him, their shoulders almost touching. The distance between them had shrunk from a canyon to a crack. You saved him, she said softly, breaking the silence of the 3 a.m. watch. You forced that man to come, but you saved him. Junho looked at his hands. I threatened him, he admitted. I used fear. It's the only language I speak fluently. Elena reached out and took his hand. Her palm was rough, calloused, warm. You're learning a new language, she said. It takes time, but tonight you spoke protection, that's a start. The touch was electric. It wasn't sexual, it was grounding. It anchored him to the earth. For a moment, the millionaire crime lord and the cleaning lady were just two tired people keeping watch over a sick old man. Tell me about them, Junho asked, gesturing to the sleeping forms around them. Not the statistics. The names, and she did. She told him about Beatrice, who had been a jazz singer before the fire took her home, and her voice. She told him about the man in the corner, who was a veteran of a war everyone wanted to forget. She told him about the teenager who had run away from an abusive foster home. She wove a tapestry of humanity that covered the cold concrete floor. Junho listened, absorbing every word, cataloging these lives not as liabilities, but as assets of the human spirit. He realized then that his empire of steel and glass was hollow. This messy, fragile, desperate community was heavy with meaning. The peace was shattered 2 days later. It wasn't the police.
It wasn't a rival gang.
It was the bureaucracy. A notice was stapled to the warehouse door. Eviction notice. Condemned. Demolition scheduled in 48 hours. The city had finally remembered this forgotten corner, not to help, but to erase. Junho arrived to find the residents in a state of quiet panic. They were packing their meager belongings into plastic bags. Beatrice was weeping, clutching her photograph. Samuel, still weak but standing, was trying to organize a protest with a broken broom handle. Elena stood in the center of the chaos, trying to be the calm in the storm, but Junho could see the cracks in her resolve. She looked at him when he entered, and for the first time, he saw defeat. "We have nowhere," she said, her voice trembling. "The shelters are full. The streets are freezing. This is it." Junho ripped the notice off the door. He read the signature at the bottom. The city zoning commissioner. A man named Vance, no. He corrected himself, remembering the constraint. A man named Commissioner Sterling. A man Junho had paid off 3 years ago to overlook a construction violation. The irony tasted like bile. The system he manipulated was now devouring the people he wanted to protect. "No," Junho said. The word was low, a growl. "You're not going anywhere," Elena looked at him. "It's the city, Junho. You can't fight the city with soup." Junho pulled out his phone. He didn't look like the carrot man anymore. He looked like the dragon. "I don't intend to fight them with soup," he said. "I intend to buy them." He dialed his lawyer. "Get the deed for the warehouse on 4th. I don't care who owns it. Offer triple.
Cash.
Tonight, he hung up and dialed another number. This one was to his construction crew, the legitimate front of his business. "Bring the trucks. Bring the lumber. Bring the insulation. We're not demolishing. We're renovating." But the obstacle wasn't just paper. As Junho barked orders, the screech of tires cut through the alley. 3 black SUVs blocked the exit. Doors opened and men stepped out. They weren't city officials. They were his men. And leading them was Dae-hyun. He wore a suit that cost more than the warehouse was worth. He looked at the homeless people with open disgust, then turned his cold gaze to Junho. "It's over, Junho," Dae-hyun said, his voice echoing off the brick walls. "You've lost your mind. You're throwing our capital into a garbage pit. The council has met. We're relieving you of command. For your own good." He gestured to the men, soldiers Junho had trained, men who owed him their allegiance. "Step aside, boss. We're clearing this place out. The city wants it down, and we have a contract to build the condos that go up in its place. You signed the deal yourself 6 months ago. Did you forget?" The revelation hit Junho like a physical blow. He had signed it. He was the developer. He was the one who had ordered the demolition. He was the destroyer coming for his own sanctuary. The horror of his past actions stood before him, embodied by Dae-hyun and the contract. The residents backed away, terrified. Elena looked at him, the betrayal flashing in her eyes before she saw the genuine horror in his. She realized he hadn't known, or rather, he hadn't cared enough to remember until now. Junho stepped forward, placing himself between his soldiers and the people. He unbuttoned his jacket. He didn't draw a weapon. He just stood there, a solitary figure against the army he had created. "If you want to clear this place," Junho said, his voice steady, projecting the absolute authority that had made him a kingpin, "you have to go through me. And, you know, Dae-hyun. You know I don't fall easily," Dae-hyun sneered. "You're one man, Junho. You're soft. You've been peeling vegetables while we've been running the streets." Dae-hyun signaled the men. "Move him." 2 enforcers stepped forward, batons in hand. The residents gasped. Elena grabbed a heavy ladle, ready to fight. But Junho didn't flinch. He looked the first enforcer in the eye. "Minho. I paid for your mother's surgery last year." The man froze. Junho looked at the second. "Kyung-soo. I forgave your debt when you messed up the Incheon drop." He looked at the group. "I built you. I fed you. And now you want to evict the elderly for a condo?" Is that what we are? Just bullies in expensive suits. The silence stretched, taut as a piano wire. The men hesitated. Loyalty warred with greed. Dae-hyun saw the hesitation and snarled, pulling his own gun. Enough of this sentimental trash. He aimed at Junho. Step aside, or I take the crown the hard way. The click of the safety was deafening. But before Dae-hyun could fire, a sound came from the shadows. It wasn't a gunshot. It was a shuffle. 100 shuffles. The residents of the warehouse, Beatrice, Samuel on his crutches, the veteran, the teenager, moved forward. They didn't have guns. They had their bodies. They formed a wall around Junho. Elena stood right next to him, her hand gripping his arm. You want him? She challenged Dae-hyun, her voice ringing clear and fearless. You take all of us. It was a standoff between the power of violence and the power of dignity. Dae-hyun looked at the wall of broken people shielding the Mafia boss. He looked at his own men, who were lowering their batons, shamed by the courage of the weak. The spell of the syndicate was broken by the reality of the human condition. Dae-hyun's hand wavered. He realized he had lost the room. He had lost the men. Not to force, but to something he couldn't name. A moral weight he couldn't lift. He lowered the gun, spat on the ground, and turned back to his car. You're finished, Junho, he called out, though his voice lacked conviction. You're broke. You're soft. You're nothing.
Imama, Junu Rapliakiatli.
The SUVs retreated, leaving a cloud of exhaust and a stunned silence. Junho turned to the people who had saved him. He turned to Elena. She was crying, silent tears tracking through the dust on her face. He reached out and wiped one away with his thumb. I'm sorry, he whispered. I almost destroyed this. But you didn't, she said, leaning into his touch. You stood. 6 months later. The warehouse does not look like a warehouse. The windows are clear glass, letting in streams of golden afternoon light. The walls are painted a warm, buttery yellow. There is a smell of roasting chicken and fresh bread, not expired, but baked on-site in the new industrial kitchen. The sign above the door does not say shelter, it says the hearth. Junho stands at the stove. He is not wearing an Italian suit. He is wearing jeans and a white apron that is stained with tomato sauce. He looks younger, the lines of stress around his eyes replaced by laugh lines. He is no longer the king of the underworld. He liquidated it all. The cars, the penthouse, the investments. He kept enough to buy the building and endow the trust that runs it. He is not rich anymore, not by the bank standards. But as he looks out over the dining hall, where Samuel is teaching a young runaway how to play chess, where Beatrice is singing a jazz standard to a rapt audience, where the broken pieces of the city have been reassembled into a mosaic of family, he knows he is wealthy beyond measure. Elena walks up behind him. She wraps her arms around his waist, resting her chin on his shoulder. She doesn't call him Mr. Park anymore. She doesn't even call him boss. The bread is ready, she murmurs. Junho turns in her arms. He kisses her forehead, a gesture of infinite tenderness. Then let's feed them, he says. They walk out of the kitchen together, carrying the baskets of bread. The room erupts in greetings. There is noise. There is mess. There is life. Junho pauses for a moment, looking directly at you. Yes, you. The story is over, but the work isn't. We build a home here in the script, but there are warehouses in your city, right now, full of people waiting for a champion. You don't need to be a mafia boss to help. You don't need millions. You just need to notice. You just need to ask. You just need to peel the first carrot. Not power, love. Not monuments, people. Look around you. Who is invisible in your world? Go see them. Go serve them. Because the only empire worth building is the one that welcomes everyone in.